a very small amount of sesame oil. That is partially because it's so difficult to extract hardly any oil out of a seed, right? Like you mentioned other fats earlier that we've been consuming for a long time: coconut, avocado, olive. It's even debatable whether, our olive cultivation was primarily for consumption or whether it was just used more as like ointment. We're not even really sure what the use was. But if you take an olive and you squeeze an olive in your hand, or an avocado and you squeeze an avocado in your hand, fat will ooze out of your hand. Like there's a lot of fat there. When you're talking about some of these seeds, just by the nature of the thing, there's no way you could consume a lot of them because it would be a tremendous amount of work if you could even do it. So this required an industrial chemical process to even extract the oil out of a seed.
Exactly. It's a very intensive industrial process to create edible oils. They're crushed, heated, pressed, and then chemically alkalinized, chemically bleached, chemically deodorized. And this is, and just to say that in a sentence makes it sound simple. This is a very, very complex process, and these oils are heated many times, at least 4 or 5 times, and then most of the oils require deodorization, and that is a high heat type of procedure. And this is where you get a lot of oxidation, and you even create trans fats in these oils. And so these oils do contain trans fats. And so for people that believe that trans fats have been removed from the food supply, it's not true at all. There's trans fats in there too.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
So Casey, I pulled up here. Can I share another graph here?
Yes, please.
Okay.
It's so interesting. Again, if you're listening to this, you're seeing this, like, it looks like the stock market, man. Like it's just, there's some good years and bad years, and it'll go up and down a little bit, but it's always trending upwards in a pretty clear line.
Right, exactly. So here we see, this is a graph from the US, and this again is our data. And I shouldn't really say our data, but this is our graph, and this data is ultimately, in terms of the sugar and the vegetable oils, comes from published data in one of our papers, but ultimately most of the data since 1961 comes from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and data before that comes from the Department of Commerce mostly, and the Economic Research Service. But anyway, so here we see, this is obesity in the United States versus sugars and vegetable oils. And people may not realize this, but in the 19th century, obesity was in men age 18 to 80 was 1.2%. So it's incredibly low. And you can, if you're seeing this graph, you'll see that by 1961, obesity was 13.4%. Now, I always point out, this is when Americans look back at, our ancestors of 1961, when it just looks like most of the population was really, really lean. But incredibly, obesity had risen 11-fold by that point, from 1.2% up to 13.4%. Now, and I should point out, there is no data on obesity in women in the 19th century at all. But anyway, and then jumping forward by 2018, obesity is 42.5% in the United States, and overweight is an additional 31%, I believe, roughly. But anyway, it puts obesity and overweight today, as of 2018, at 74%. But take a look here. So if you go back here, you can see that we had almost no vegetable oils in the 19th century when obesity was really low. But look how high sugars were. So sugars, as I mentioned earlier, were 10%. By 1890, they were about 15% of the diet. By 1910, and I'm just pulling these numbers from my head, so these are not exact. But by 1935, though, sugar was 440 calories, and I know this one by heart, in 1935, and that was 22.5% of the diet. So sugar was really high by 1935, but obesity was roughly around 3 or 4%, we don't have exact numbers, so we had to, well, that's interpolated data, again, because it's all we have is the data from the 19th century, and then the next data is on obesity is 1961. But everybody can see this, that sugars really didn't change very much after 1935. I mean, we peaked in 1999, and then it's been falling, sugar's been falling since that. And if you'll notice that obesity follows the vegetable oils almost perfectly. And most interestingly, even as sugar has been falling since 1999, and carbohydrates, I could show in another graph, have been falling since 1997, obesity continues to skyrocket. So, for those who want to, blame sugar for the cause of this, you really got a difficult argument there to make, because, there's so much evidence, and I can show, 4 other countries, which we won't go into, but that, where sugar is falling and obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome continue to just skyrocket. In fact, it's even worse, as you see here.
Yeah.
So no, I'll just point out, Casey, that, this quite frankly, this angers some people, just the fact that I'm pointing this out, but data is data. I can't make this up. This is all published data. And you just have to look at it, and you can come to your own conclusions. But the reality is that we have very little correlation here between obesity and sugar consumption, but we have this striking correlation between obesity and vegetable oils.
Do you know how many charts you included in your book? There must be hundreds.
Yeah, there's 80 graphs. Not all of those are ours, but the huge bulk of those are. And then there's another 40 tables, I believe. And then we've got about 30 other images, mostly photos.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. So that's something that was very, very striking to me, is not just this one graph, but pretty much in every graph. If you're looking to find correlations and patterns, it always trends with vegetable oil. It is not concordant with sugar, which, again, that is really surprising. It's surprising to me. And we're looking at obesity here, but maybe now would be a good time to go back. Let's go back to the 1850s and 1900s. What do we know from the medical records? What diseases were people suffering from? What were people dying from? Were they dying from the same causes of death that people die from today?
No, not at all. That's a great question. So in the 19th century, people died mostly of infectious disease. So it was gastrointestinal infections, pneumonia, and I forget what the third major one, but they're all infectious diseases, and these took the lives of a lot of children in that era. But in the 19th century, as I've reviewed in presentations many times, coronary heart disease was effectively unknown. There was 8 papers published in the 19th century on coronary heart disease. 8. I mean, there's been 8 papers published on coronary heart disease while we've been talking, probably. It's just, there's just thousands and thousands of papers, on coronary heart disease in the last, in the last few years, right? But 8 papers on coronary heart disease in the 19th century. Sir William Osler, published a great deal about this, and in his first book, in 1893, he had witnessed about 6 cases of angina, chest pain, in the previous 21 years, but he'd never witnessed a heart attack. And the first heart attack was, documented by James Herrick in the United States in 1912, documented with autopsy evidence. And then by the 1930s, coronary heart disease became the leading cause of death. So if we talk about cancer, in the town of Boston, Massachusetts, in 1811, cancer took the lives of 1 in 188 people, 0.5%. Whereas by 1900, cancer took the lives of 1 in 17 people, 5.6%, I believe that is. By 2010, cancer took the lives of 31.2% of Americans, so roughly 1 in 3. So in other words, in 200 years, we went from cancer causing the deaths of 1 in 188 people to 1 in 3. Why? Well, processed foods is the short answer. Processed foods that are loaded with sugars, refined flours, and vegetable oils. That's primarily what they're made of. So lots of other chronic diseases. Diabetes was an extraordinary medical rarity. We could look at data on that, but in 1890, from the U.S. Census, diabetes affected 2.8 per 100,000 people. That's 0.0028% of the population. What was it in 2016? I believe it was 13%. So diabetes has increased between 1890 and 2016, I believe it was, increased 4,643-fold. Metabolic syndrome, 19th century, unknown. Alzheimer's disease, it was unknown. Age-related macular degeneration, as far as I could tell, only a handful of cases described. Autoimmune diseases were rare. So I could go on, you can go and keep looking, but the reality is you just don't hardly find all the chronic diseases that plague us today. They were virtually unknown in the 19th century when we had very little processed foods.